Hello, museologists. I'm sorry about having to cancel class earlier this week. I had a very tragic death in the family that concerned a family member that was located overseas, so that created all kinds of complications to work through. So I'm making this webcast to help catch us up and keep us on track with our current schedule. So last time we had talked about mission statements and their importance, and then we started to talk about policies and procedures. And so now we're going to continue that discussion of policies and procedures and talk about some of the details of how objects should be handled and how to deal with them within a museum context. So we already talked about mission statements. Sorry, I have something stuck on my keyboard here. And I can't get it out. That's classic. In any case, we talked about mission statements and how critically important they are to driving everything that happens in an institution. And so they therefore will organically relate to strategic plans that will be developed to move forward those missions. And then part of those strategic plans include policies and procedures for enacting that strategic plan. And we started to talk about that last time. And so one example that we're going to talk about in detail is the collections plan, or what's sometimes referred to as the collections management plan. Although I think most people see this as two different things. The collections plan concerns what's going to be collected, and the management plan concerns how those objects are going to be taken care of and treated and used. So the collections plan, or the collections policy, derives from the mission statement. And the common elements that are usually included in that collections policy and plan include what's going to be collected, where it's going to be collected, how they're going to be collected, why they're going to be collected, so how those collections are going to be used. And interestingly enough, one very important aspect of that plan is the de-accession policies. So if it ever is the case that there are items within your collections that you need to dispose of, they're no longer useful, or maybe your mission and focus has changed and therefore they shouldn't be included in your collections, then there are times when you will need to de-accession those objects and then find some way to dispose of them. And disposal can actually consist of giving them away, or selling them, or in some cases it means actually putting them in the trash. So we're going to talk about the details of disposal and how it relates to the collection policy later on in this lecture. So the first part of this is that, so we're going to go through each of those elements, the how and the why and the where. So there are two terms that are often conflated: acquisition versus accession, and they're very distinct things within a museum context. So there's a famous quote in the museum literature that says, "All accessioned objects are acquired, but not all acquisitions are accessioned." What that's really referring to is the fact that you first need to acquire an object physically and bring it into the institution, but you might not necessarily put it in your permanent collections. It's only when you put it in your permanent collections and take legal ownership of it that you then have an accession. So an acquisition is defined here as being items whose physical presence is in the museum, but you don't actually legally own it yet. Okay? When you decide to take legal title over those objects, then they are accessioned. Okay? And so usually you do this for permanent collections that you're going to keep in perpetuity. If you're acquiring objects that will be used in the short term or just are loans, then these are just acquisitions. They're not accessions. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. So here I'd say an accession is an object acquired by a museum for its permanent collection. It's the act of recording or processing an addition to the permanent collection. So what else might you do with non-accessioned acquisitions? You could use them for educational programs. Maybe these are items that you think are probably going to break down easily. And so therefore you don't want, because they're sort of disposable, you might not want to include them in your permanent objects. Sometimes what museums will decide is that if you have real artifacts, so real historical objects or natural history objects, Those you want to have in your permanent collections, but if you make reproductions that you then want to use, say, in educational programs, well, those are, if you will, fake items. And so you may not want those in your permanent collections. And so those will be acquisitions, not accessions. And so you might not give it a catalog number. You might, or you might not. Maybe if you have a loan from another institution that you're using for exhibiting purposes, well, clearly you don't own that. The other institution owns that. And so those would be examples of things that you could acquire for a particular purpose, but they're not actually being accessioned into your collection. Now, if there are things that you decide to de-accession, or let's say a donor has come to you and said, hey, here's some objects I'd like to donate to the museum, and you take them, and then you decide, I don't really, so some of these objects I think we can use, some of these objects I really don't think we can use, then you could sell them, you could transfer them to some other institution, or you could do pretty much whatever you want with them. So there's actually different types of acquisitions. So there are what are called gifts, where the title passes during the life of the donor. So if any donor comes and presents objects for your museum that you think you might want to acquire and actually later accession, and it's during the life of them, then it's called a gift. Now there's different kinds of gifts. There's unrestricted and restricted gifts, and they're just as they sound. So in some cases the donor says, here you go, I'd like to donate this to the museum. I don't care how you use it in any way that you wish. And in some cases they insist on it being a restricted gift, whereby they say, okay, I want this always to be displayed next to my picture, or something of that nature. It's usually advisable to try to encourage the donor to not put any restrictions on the gifts, because sometimes in the future it's often hard to adhere to those restrictions. Not always, but sometimes. So it's always best if you can avoid those. Oh, so I say all that here. Now, if you are to receive a gift, then what you need is a form called a deed of gift form. And so there's certain kinds of information anybody can make a deed of gift form. There's all kinds of templates on the web, and most museum database programs have them inside them as well. But some basic information that you will need for a deed of gift is the name of the donor, and clearly the name of the recipient, obviously. The title of the object, so what is this thing, and a description, usually a pretty thorough description that lets you know if there are any parts that are broken or damaged. But basically, so that you can, if you have more than one object of this type, let's say you're getting a kind of vase, right? Well, if you have more than one vase that looks like this, then you want to be able to describe it in such a way that you can distinguish between them. So just simply saying a blue flower vase probably isn't going to cut it. So you want the name and contact information, the title and description of the object, and then the transfer of ownership. So basically you make a formal agreement to transfer, right? And you decide if there's going to be restrictions or not. And then when you're going to actually make this exchange. So when is the object actually going to come into your hands, into your physical presence? Now, a second kind of acquisition is what's called a bequest. So this is what happens after you've passed. Okay, so it's a gift if the transfer happens when you're alive. It's a bequest if it happens after you die. And so generally speaking, what this means is that the person that has passed away has some sort of will, and they've willed these objects or items to some institution. So you're definitely going to need a copy of the will in order to make this legal. In some cases, museums do not know in advance that they're going to be getting these objects. Hopefully someone has notified them, there's been some agreement, but sometimes it's unknown. So a deed of gift is clearly not appropriate in this case. What you want is a copy of the will. Now, that being said, if someone wills objects to a museum, the museum does not have to accept them. You can accept part of it, none of it, or the whole thing. And then bear in mind that when you accept these objects, you can actually do whatever you want with them. Now, the difficulty comes in if they try to um, if the will tries to institute some sort of restriction on the donation, but legally you're not held to that because you didn't enter into that agreement during the life. And so there are some examples where you can actually wiggle out of that. But there are also some situations where lawyers will say, no, that's part of the agreement. You either agree to take it with these restrictions or you don't agree to take it. So ownership of those objects, legal ownership, isn't complete until the administration of the estate is approved by the court. So in some cases, they may will you these objects, but maybe the entire estate has to go through probate and has to go through legal processing before you're actually allowed to take ownership of the objects. You can also purchase objects. So museums do this all the time. They often have particular funding lines that allow them to acquire objects specifically for certain kinds of collections. So if you're going to purchase items, there are a number of ways you can do it. You can just directly buy it. You can go right up to someone, you have funds for it, and buy those objects. You can go to auctions, bargain sales, or sometimes there's actually exchanges that you can engage in with either people or more often institutions. So in order to make this legal and to take legal ownership, then you must have clearly the bill of sale or some sort of receipt showing when and where you purchased these objects. Now, for certain kinds of collections, there's what's called field collections. So for biologists like myself, or for maybe anthropologists who are doing archaeology of some kind, then what you might do is you might go out into the field and actually collect those objects to then acquire into your collection. And so those are going to require all kinds of permits that the institution or the individuals will have to acquire before they go collecting. And then if it's international, they'll need export permits as well. And we'll talk about those kinds of permits later on in the semester. So we'll talk about legal aspects of collecting later. But anyway, I say here that field collections are made for science collections or for, say, anthropology, which is also a life science. They could be purchases. I've actually seen people do this where you go in the field and you ask people to help you acquire the items that you're after, say your species or your fossils, and you pay them to help you. But generally speaking, you're making them yourself. And in this case, you usually have some pretty extensive field notes that explains what you've collected and how you've collected them. And so the museum should always obtain a copy of those field notes to go along with those collections wherever possible. Now, it's rare, but sometimes there are things that are called conversions that can be acquisitions to your collection. So what these are old loans that were not reclaimed by owners. So for instance, we had an example of this not so long ago in our museum where decades ago, an exhibit was designed and installed in our museum, and it concerned African American baseball players. And there was a donor in town that had some original objects belonging to an African American baseball player. And so those were displayed in the exhibit gallery. And then years and years went by, and we decided at one point to finally take that exhibit down and to replace it with something else. And when we did, we realized that it had been so long that we no longer had any contact information for that donor. The donor had requested that the items be returned to them if the exhibit should ever be brought down. But it appears that the donor had passed away. And so we attempted to locate next of kin to see if they wanted the objects. And we failed to do that. So after putting out a public notice of, hey, that we have these objects, that we're looking for family members to whom they might belong, failing that, what you can then do after a certain time period, a certain statute of limitations is run out, and you can then actually take ownership of those objects. And so there is a legal process whereby you can file paperwork to say, okay, these objects are now ours. So there's gifts, bequests, you can purchase items, field collections, and conversions. These are the different types of acquisitions that you should be familiar with. So the collections plan should include all of these types of acquisitions if they are things that they want to include in, if these are ways that you want to acquire objects. And then within each of these types of acquisitions, there should be details for how you might acquire these objects, how the paperwork that needs to be included, and then how you'll file that paperwork and who's responsible. So basically make it as detailed as possible so that anyone can follow it. So this is basically the procedure. Here's kind of, in summary, what would happen. So an object of interest may be either transported to the museum or the curator can be notified of that item. Ideally, the curator goes to see the item. It's a little bit dangerous if the donor brings it to the museum before you've approved of the acquisition because they have a tendency to leave it. And then there's a legal issue there where they've left it in your possession, but you may or may not actually want it. And then you have to deal with it. So it's a lot easier if you kind of avoid any messiness and then don't have the donor bring it to you. Instead, you go see it. But it happens all the time. So you become aware of some object. There's a curatorial proposal for acquiring the object that's produced. So we've talked about this already in class. There's a consultation among all the museum officials. Legal issues are reviewed. And then you decide if you want to accept it as a gift or not. And if you do, you draw up a deed of gift. Clearly, if it's something that you're going to purchase, you would then, purchase it, get a warranty of title, so on and so forth. So the intent to donate is written up. The deed of gift is developed. And usually 2 or 3 copies are signed. So usually the donor will sign each of the copies, and then usually the curator is the other person that's signing the deed of gift. So 2 people sign it, the donor and the recipient. And the reason that there are 2 or 3 is because one of those copies should be, and these are all originals, one of those copies should be left with the donor as a receipt that the object has transferred ownership from them to your institution. And then the other copies will go, generally speaking, either to the registrar and then to the archives, or often what happens is if you don't have an archivist, it'll go to the registrar and then the curator will keep a second copy. So generally speaking, there's 3 copies that get made. And then an agenda is developed. And so here I say that above this is the acquisition procedure, and then past this point is the beginning of the accession process. But really, that's not really accurate. Once the deed of gift has been drawn up and once it's signed, at that point, you've made the accession. Like legally, that object is yours. But what I'd like to talk about here is what happens after that deed of gift has changed hands. So there are some really specific procedures that need to be followed through within the museum. So the first is that everything that comes in the museum is going to be assigned an accession number. And a file is going to be opened, literally a physical and an electronic file will be opened for that object. Now, when an accession number is assigned for an object, it usually in every museum has this sort of format. So it's the year plus it's a consecutive number. So within a given year, a number of objects might be acquired by the museum, and those each get a chronological number. So the first object of the year, if it was this year, would be 2017-1, and then the next object, 2017-2, 3, 4, and so on. Okay? And so I've got examples here of, what if these objects were collected in 2006? Well, there's 2006-1, 2, 3. And museums differ on whether it's a dash, or whether it's a dot, or whether it's a semicolon, or a colon, or whatever, right? It's most often a dash. Now, once it's actually been assigned, oh, and by the way, if the donor donates more than one object, generally speaking, the entire suite of objects from that donor is given a single acquisition number. So the donor might be giving you 10 objects, but collectively they're all going to be assigned 2017-50. And then if in your museum, if you want to distinguish with the accession number, if you want to distinguish the separate objects, you could do 2017-50, and then maybe there's 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 that gets applied to each of them. But in some cases, what they'll do is they'll simply assign one accession number, and then each of them will get an individual catalog number. And we'll get to catalog numbers in just a minute. So when the object comes in, it gets photographed to document not only exactly what it is, but the state that it's in. All of the information regarding the donor and any provenance on the object and its condition, all of that's going to get entered into a computerized system. And officially, this would sort of complete your accession process. Now, I ask here who assigns the accession number, and that's always going to be your registrar. The registrar is the person that's in charge of the acquisition. So remember, they're in charge of all the logistics and what's happening within and in the museum. And so they're the ones that are going to not only assign the number, but then determine, which curator is going to handle it, and then also gets information from the curator to add to the acquisition file for these objects. There will be, by the way, some decisions made, usually early on in the situation, regarding what these objects are going to be used for. So are they going to be used for research, for educational purposes, for programs, for exhibiting? What are they going to be used for? And then the curator will make decisions regarding where it's going to be stored and how it's going to be used and so forth. And it's possible that these objects can be used for multiple different purposes. So sometimes it's the case that you need to streamline your collection. So you need to get rid of some objects in your collection for a number of reasons. And so that process is referred to as de-accessioning objects. So basically you're reversing the legal process. So now you want to relinquish your legal ownership of them, and then you need to do something with those objects now that you've relinquished that ownership. So as I mentioned earlier, it's the de-accessioning process is considered controversial by some. Some people feel you should never do this, that somehow this is a breach of ethics. But more people are concerned about the potential liabilities. So let's say you said you were going to take some objects from a wealthy patron and that you were going to keep them forever, and then that patron passes away, and then you decide you're going to sell it off. Well, that sort of reduces some of your credibility to the general public. Well, you just accepted those objects just to get that guy's money, and now you're getting rid of it. Well, most museums are not actually doing that. But there are some interesting stories where museums have come under fire, or maybe they're in financial crisis, and so they do sell off objects in order to stay afloat. Again, we're going to talk about the legal aspects of that a little bit later. But just suffice it to say that there are many good reasons for disposing of objects, and then there are some bad reasons. And we've just talked about some of that. So a little bit more on that. So you might get rid of them because items are outside the scope of the mission. Maybe they're deteriorating. Maybe they would be put to better purpose somewhere else. So what is the de-accession process? So it's basically the reverse of what you did to acquire it in the first place. So there's a written curatorial process that's drawn up. A written curatorial justification for why you want to get rid of the object. There's a review of the legal status and restrictions. So are you actually legally allowed to de-accession the object? A conservator or someone is going to evaluate the object to determine its current state. So has it deteriorated? What kind of condition is it in? Usually there's some sort of outside appraisal of value. So especially if you're planning to sell it, right? So no one within the museum should ever engage in any sort of appraisal of an object for insurance purposes or sale purposes or for any reason. So there's a conflict of interest there because, and we'll talk about examples of this, museum people might intentionally or unintentionally inflate the price or value, deflate the price or value. And so that should be left up to people or institutions that are not in conflict, that are outside of the museum and the donor or the person to whom it may actually end up going to. So you want an independent assessment of the value of that object. Everyone within the museum ideally is actually reviewing this proposal to get rid of these objects and de-accession them. And then ultimately what happens is that proposal will go to the board and the director of the museum, and if there's a CEO, to the CEO, to be approved. And once they've approved, then you can legally deaccession that object. Now, there's a critically important point here. So these are items that you had in your legal ownership. There was all kinds of data in your files and in your database, which is hopefully electronic. When you deaccession an object and decide to dispose of it, you do not ever get rid of those files or that information. Never, ever, ever. What you do is you do mark it as deaccession, and sometimes there's actually red ink that goes on it, or a red font that's in your database. So it'll be marked as deaccession, but you still keep all of that information. And I will tell you lots of horror stories in class next week about what happens when you destroy the info. Okay, when you decide to deaccession objects, you are not legally required or obligated to notify anybody, but especially the donors. Some museums do elect to do that if the owners or family of the owners or the previous owners are still alive. They may notify them that they're going to do something with them. But sometimes this creates more problems than it's worth. It may create hard feelings. The owners may feel like you somehow devalued their objects, or maybe the memory of their loved one who donated it originally. But remember, once you take legal ownership, it's yours. So as long as you're not engaging in any activities that are contradictory to the agreement, then you're fine. You can do whatever you want. It's yours. But you can see the conflict it could generate if you notify them that now you're disposing of them. Okay, so what are the disposal options? So this is going to vary depending on the kinds of collections that you're talking about and the situation. It should never, ever be the case that museum staff actually acquire disposed objects. This is a clear conflict of interest. The public might inquire as to, well, so why was the museum getting rid of it in the first place? It sort of lends the appearance that they got rid of it just so this one person could benefit by actually acquiring it for their own personal collection, right? So it's definitely the case that sometimes museum staff members, they got into this for a reason. They have a love and a passion for this field, and so they might actually be collectors themselves. But if that's the case, then there needs to be a disclosure statement when they're hired. And then there needs to be some agreement worked out, because you can imagine that if an employee is trying to acquire objects that the museum is also trying to acquire for their collections, there's going to be a conflict of interest there and some competition. So that needs to be settled first before anyone is hired. And ideally, you just don't engage in those collection activities if you're working at a museum that acquires those objects. Okay, so what can you do? You can take those objects and you can donate them to some other institution for their use or purposes. So for instance, we have natural history specimens that we are looking to deaccession and dispose of, but there's a nature center nearby that could really use those objects and put them to great use. So we are likely to donate them to that nature center. You could exchange them with another institution, and that's actually happening too. So I have colleagues that work at other institutions, and I have said, like, hey, I'm looking for certain kinds of species. Do you have them? And they'll say, oh, yeah. But do you happen to have any of these other species that we're trying to look for? Oh, yes, we do. And so we could exchange them. You can then decide to put them into educational programs or research programs. So maybe you're not engaging in these operations, but someone else might be, and they can make really great use of them. Educational programs are great because these are objects that are primarily handled quite a bit, and they can often break down. So you might be frequently looking for replacements for your educational objects. You can physically destroy them, and sometimes that's the only option. Clearly, when you do that, you're always going to keep a record of the fact that it was physically destroyed. And with a lot of, for instance, natural history objects, you're not allowed to just put them in the trash if they're deteriorating. They have to be incinerated, and they have to be done so in a particular manner. And so you often have special waste removal companies that will come and pick up these items and then incinerate them for you. Certain kinds of objects can be repatriated. So if you have Native American remains in your collections, then they must be repatriated to where they came from and or to the tribe to which they might belong if that tribe still exists. And we've actually engaged in that. So we had a number of different Native American remains whose affiliation was unclear. We could narrow it down to, say, three tribes that it could have been, but because of the location and the situation in which they were collected, we weren't necessarily able to narrow it down further. But there was a consortium of Native American tribes, a collaboration, and they agreed to jointly accept these objects, and they were then buried and following their tribal rituals. So you can actually send them back to the point of origin. Some books will tell you that you can return them to the donor, but that is strongly advised against. It creates all kinds of ill will, conflict of interest issues. So even though there are books that say this, most museum professionals would tell you do not ever do this. It's too much of a conflict of interest. And you can sell them. You can have private sales or public auctions, either way, to transfer ownership of these items. If you do that, if you sell it, then those funds can only be used to develop future collections. They cannot be used for anything else. They can't be used to pay bills. They can't be used to pay staff. They can only be used towards collections development. Private sale or public auction is one of the most usual options. If you do this, you should allow several firms to bid on the object so that you can get the most objective price for them. You should definitely make sure of the provenance of your objects. So if you haven't ever watched Antiques Roadshow, you should, because these are great examples of having good or bad provenance on an object, so knowing where it came from and knowing its story. And then sometimes actually lacking that information leads you down different roads of conclusions about what it's all about. So sometimes you think you have something that's real, but it's fake, but you didn't know it. When you're doing this, the registrar will handle most of the details. So they're going to handle the, how it's going to be transferred, the marketing, paperwork that's come through regarding its provenance, its estimated value, so on and so forth. And then its actual value when it's actually sold. Some museums will have a press release regarding the sale, and they'll advertise the fact that they sold something and how much they sold it for and why they sold it. But again, anytime you sell anything for whatever reason, those funds should only be used to develop the collection further and only for the collection. And so that's what I talk about here. So disposal options, handling the proceeds. So generally, you're only allowed to use the proceeds for acquisitions or for the direct care of collections. Okay. So what are the alternatives to deaccessioning? There are some other alternatives that we haven't discussed yet. So you can do a long-term loan. You can actually, give it to another institution, let's say. The benefits of this are that it frees up space in your institution. You still own it, so you still have, legal ownership. And it does provide public access, so somebody else is making use of it. But the problem with doing a long-term loan is that you need to monitor it to make sure that it's being well taken care of. Now you don't have access to it or not easy access. And there's the possibility that someone's going to forget about this and it's going to stay at that other institution and then they're going to do a conversion and acquire it. So there are some pros and cons to long-term loans. I mean, you could share with another museum or collaborate, but you just got to be careful about how that's done. You might wonder what loans are. So what are they and why would you do it? So loans are just what they sound like. They're items that are transferred temporarily to other institutions or individuals. Generally speaking, it goes to an institution. They can be used for exhibition purposes. So maybe you're doing an exhibit on some theme and you've got some artifacts, but you don't have everything you need, but you know about other exhibits at another institution. So you can borrow them for the purposes of your exhibition. A lot of research is done on loaned objects. So I spent my whole career working on specimens that I borrowed from museums or individuals to understand the species that I'm working on. Things that are called promised gifts, which I didn't talk about earlier, are sometimes considered loans until the title is conferred. So a promised gift is when a donor has one or more objects that they say they want to give to the museum, but they're not ready to let go of them yet. So they're saying they're going to gift it to you, and they've maybe even filled out paperwork saying that they're promising it to you, but they haven't done it yet. So sometimes that's considered a loan. And sometimes what they'll do is they will, in fact, give it to you, but they don't go through the transferal of title. So they still own it, but it's physically at your institution. So you can think of that as being a kind of a loan. It's usually not a good idea to do that. The promised gift aspect, that is. The loan is fine. So generally with loans, the protocol and the procedure is pretty straightforward. So an incoming loan is one that's coming to your museum. So the individual at the museum sends a detailed letter describing the purpose, listing their, the items that they are requesting, how long they want it for, what they're going to do with it. The lender notifies the museum of its request. So are they going to, allow you to have it or not? The items are then sent, and usually with copies of paperwork. So they have in there what they said they sent to you, and then there's usually 2 copies. And so you then say, you check to make sure that, yes, everything that you said you sent is here and it's all in good condition. And then you sign that form and you send it back to the original lender to say, like, yep, it all got here just fine, so they know. And then when that museum receives them, often they'll actually give it a loan number. Sometimes they won't, but sometimes they'll actually open a file and here's the loan numbers. The items are used for the stated purpose, and then they're packed up and then returned back to the original museum. And when they do that, they send another copy of that info and say, like, okay, here's all the objects I'm sending back. Here's the condition that they're in. And of course, the original museum will compare the condition that they're in now to the condition that they're in when they sent them to make sure that they're in good shape or not. And then you'll be notified if they're not in good shape. If it's an outgoing loan, so your institution is actually sending something out, then clearly you kind of understood it from the previous slide. So the curator either approves the request for objects or not. Somebody's going to evaluate them for their status before they are sent to the institution requesting them. The registrar checks to see if there's any commitments on them, like did we already promise them for some other purpose. And then in theory, final approval is meant to be done by a board or the director. But I've often seen it be the case that in many museums, the curator is conferred with those responsibilities. So they're allowed to give the final approval on whether a loan is granted or not. And then the items are packed and they're sent to the requesting institution with some kind of due date. Now, due dates are going to vary from institution to institution, but a sort of general rule of thumb is that if they're being used for anything besides exhibition purposes, then you can have them for roughly 6 months, and then they can be renewed just like when you renew books from a library. If they're going to be used for exhibition purposes, sometimes you want them for longer, so you need them for, say, a couple of years. But you can actually enter into that negotiation when you make the request. You can say, we'd like to have these for, 5 years, and then they will either agree or not and send them to you. Okay. Now, that's it for the lecture. We're going to do some activities in class where we'll actually assign accession numbers to objects, and then I'll have you fill out some forms and kind of go through the process of what it would really be like to fill a loan, to acquire an object and to fill a loan. And then we'll continue this discussion on Monday and talk about how you actually handle objects, gloves, and the whole 9 yards. So thanks for listening. Hope this keeps you on track, and I'll see you on Monday.